know everything today and believe almost nothing. Jesus' most well-known teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, doesn't just reform our world, it recreates our world, using not just words and concepts, but living images that grab your soul. Join Sycamore Creek as we spend 5 weeks living into the Sermon on the Mount using Richard Rohr's book, Jesus' Alternative Plan. Alongside the series, you're invited to join a small group reading Jesus' words yourself. You'll find that it is not what you know that matters or changes anything. It is what you believe, and believe all the way through.
This sermon is rated PG-13. How's that for an opening line? I'm going to give you a couple of opening lines and you tell me where they're from. First one, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man with a fortune is in want of a wife. What's that from? Yeah, all you Jane Austen fans, that's Pride and Prejudice. You're like, why in the world is Pastor Tom starting with Pride and Prejudice? Because my wife wrote a book, a dating guide, based on Pride and Prejudice. I have seen way more Pride and Prejudice movies than any husband ought to have to watch. All right, here's another opening line. Once there were 4 children, whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them because they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. What story is that the opening line from? You remember, right? Yeah, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Opening lines are so important that my wife, who is a novelist, a writer, and author, actually attended an entire workshop taught by Daniel Neary, the Newbery Award-winning author, about opening lines. Here's the opening line of his book. The first time I was stoned to death by an angry mob, I was not even a criminal. That's a hell of an opening line, isn't it? Now, since my wife is a novelist, I got to give you her opening line for her first novel, Once a Queen. Here it is. In all the old stories, in those fairy tales I still half believe, this was how it happened. Ordinary kids were visiting relatives, maybe, or stuck at a boarding school, alone, uncertain, yearning for adventure, and before long, adventure came to them. All right, we're going to come back to first lines in just a minute, but let's get back to the PG-13 rating of this message. All right, it's rated PG-13 because, well, I'm a Gen Xer and I'm going to try to use some Gen Z slang, but also because I'm going to get really real with y'all today. I'm going to swear in this message. So if you're sensitive to that for any reason, you can, well, this is the time to walk away, or you can find a beep version of it on our YouTube channel. The opening lines of Jesus' sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, are usually referred to as the Beatitudes. But that word beatitude it's such a churchy word. Sometimes it's also referred to as like, blessed are those. And I think maybe in today's language, we might say, congrats. And so Jesus' opening lines are 8 congratulations, 8 attaboys. This is for you. These 8 congratulations turn the world upside down. All right, let me start with a confession. I hate reading the Beatitudes. I hate preaching on the Beatitudes. I hate teaching on the Beatitudes. And you might ask, why, Pastor Tom, do you hate the Beatitudes? The reason is because they kick my ass. Now, in a couple of months, we're going to do a whole series just on the Beatitudes. I mean, that's how thick and deep these things are. But today we're going to do an overview of all of these 8 congratulations sayings. And sometimes my job as a pastor is to kick your ass. And sometimes my job as a pastor in my messages is to kick my own ass. Because some of us are so far away from what Jesus is describing here. Now, the old polite way that pastors would say this is that the pastor's job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. But today I'm just going to say, I'm going to give an ass whooping to those who need an ass whooping, myself included. These are the opening lines of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And he goes up this mountain and his closest disciples follow him and he talks to them. It's really interesting how Matthew says this. He says he taught his disciples. This wasn't a message for everybody. This is a message for those who are followers of Jesus. So if you're sitting in the room today and you're not a follower of Jesus, you can just ignore this. While they are congratulations for everyone, they're really teaching Jesus' disciples about the really real, about how life can and, well, maybe should be. The Beatitudes are the inaugural address, the opening lines of Jesus' sermon. The Beatitudes are a description of the free life, the life that really is real. And this makes me ask myself, is my life really real? And my answer is, it's not. Did I mention the sermon was PG-13? The Beatitudes turn the world upside down. All right, we like to stop in the middle of our messages, give you a chance to catch your breath or move over to the beeped version of this sermon if you would like it. And, well, here's the chat question. If you were going to write the opening line of Jesus' first sermon, what would it be? Or, if that's too hard of a question, what is your favorite opening line of a book or a movie? So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at each of the 8 congratulations with some short commentary on each one. Here's the first congratulation. Congrats to the poor in spirit. The reign of heaven is theirs. Or maybe, congrats you poor in spirit. You've already got the really real. What the hell? That's the opening line? Congrats you poor in spirit? All right, we're in a series called Jesus Alternative Plan based on the book by Richard Rohr called, well, Jesus Alternative Plan. And it's the very beginning. It's our opening lines, our first congratulations for an 18-month experiment where we're going to do 14 different series, all inspired by the themes in the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus starts out saying, congrats to the poor in spirit. And well, each of these translations, by the way, you're never going to find them out on the internet. They're either Richard Rohr's translations or my translations or some hodgepodge of the two. Now, this is the way that Matthew records Jesus' opening lines, but Luke, one of Jesus' earliest followers as well, records not a Sermon on the Mount, but a Sermon on the Plain. And Luke makes this, well, opening line a lot more concrete. He says, congrats to you who are poor. Luke's audience is probably the poor and the hurting. You see, he's a doctor, so he's working all the time with this population. And it was when I was first reading the Bible from cover to cover as a young adult in my early to mid-20s that I first read this whole account of Jesus' life, really from beginning to end in Luke. And Sarah and I had just bought a house, and it was in moments like this where Jesus says, congrats you who are poor, that Sarah and I started on a trajectory that our life went on for decades after that. You see, we had just bought a house and we started to share it with other people. We realized that Jesus was kicking our ass and telling us to, well, share our stuff. And as a married couple with no kids with a house, we had more space than we needed. Jesus' opening lines of this sermon push me to change the way I live. And of course, this hasn't always been easy. But Jesus says, congrats. So Luke opens with congrats to you who are poor, but Matthew opens with congrats to the poor in spirit. The reign of heaven is theirs. Now, Luke is speaking to the economic poor. He's speaking to the guy living under the bridge, panhandling during the day just to get his next meal. But Matthew is speaking to a different audience. Matthew is speaking to something of a middle-class group of Jewish Christians who don't live in Israel, maybe in Damascus, Syria. So Matthew records Jesus' words a little different. He says, congrats to the poor in spirit. In Matthew's version, I experience a, teensy-weensy bit of grace. Probably because Matthew's speaking to people similar to my situation in life. What is this poor in spirit? What does that mean? Poor in spirit is probably a kind of inner emptiness, sort of rejection of climbing the corporate ladder, of accumulating more and more. The humble. You know, the higher that you go up in leadership or the higher you go up in the corporate ladder, the more that you have to toe the party line, the more that you have to be careful with what you say and how you say it. And for good reason, because the higher up you are in the power structure, the more damage you can do with your words. I mean, I know this. We started out at Sycamore Creek as one campus. I used to be just the only pastor at Sycamore Creek, but now we have 3 campuses and 3 pastors. And it takes work for the 3 of us to coordinate how we do this thing called Sycamore Creek and to coordinate it together. So Jesus says, congrats to the poor in spirit. The reign of heaven is theirs. The really real, the free life, it's theirs right now. That's the first congratulations. The second congratulations is this. Congrats to those who mourn. They shall be comforted. Judith Orliff, a medical doctor, writes for the magazine Psychology Today, explaining that our tears don't just clean our eyes of physical debris, that tears can also cleanse our bodies of toxins. They're emotional tears, that these toxins need to be released. Richard Rohr says, to men's groups, I say that the young man who cannot cry is a savage, and the old man who cannot laugh is a fool. All right, here's another confession. I get numb to the pain and the tragedy of this world. I read about it every morning. I read the New York Times. I read about it in the Wall Street Journal. I read about it locally in the Lansing State Journal. I listen to it on NPR. I get numb to it. And I have to work really hard as somebody who lives in the middle class and kind of a, pretty stable situation. I have to work hard to cry, to lament with those who are crying and lamenting in our world. Do you cry for the injustices of the world? Do you hurt with those who hurt? Jesus reminds us to give a. All right, we looked at the second congratulations, which is congrats to those of you who mourn. Here's the third congratulations. Congrats to the gentle. They shall have the earth as their inheritance. Now, gentle is often translated as meek, which who in the world knows what meek is? And this is like the whole meek and mild Jesus. But here's what I think it means. I think it means the nonviolent. Those who are not willing to use violence to accomplish their goals. The gentle, the meek, the nonviolent. To be gentle and meek and nonviolent is not weak. It's not to get run over by everybody else. I mean, I think about Martin Luther King Jr., who practiced nonviolent active resistance. These are some of the bravest people that I know in our history who are willing to absorb with their bodies the blows of police officers, the bites of police dogs, the hoses of firemen, without fighting back physically. To live a nonviolent life is to live a life of strength. Now, Jesus goes on in his congratulations to say this, they shall have the earth as their inheritance. Landlords, well, in a lot of ways today, but especially back in Jesus' day, were hated people. They owned the land. They owned the property. The whole situation back in Jesus' day and age reminds me a lot of the situation today in America when it comes to Native Americans. Recently, I was listening to, along with my family and my boys on a car ride, a book called A Walk in the Park by Kevin Fedarko. The book recounts Kevin and his photographer friend who through hiked the Grand Canyon. It's a 700-mile trip from the beginning of the Grand Canyon to its end. And what's really hard about it is that there's no actual trail. You have to go down into the canyon and up the canyon and away. And well, if you've ever seen pictures of it, you know how hard that would be. It's nearly impossible. Very few people have ever done it. But what Federico and his photographer came across, not just the beauty of the canyon, but the people who live there and have lived there in the past. And he recounts the story of how Native Americans in the area have been so poorly treated by America, by the National Park Service, and by so many other groups and organizations. Take, for example, the Havasupai. The Havasupai lived on 1.6 million acres of land. Now, just for comparison, the Grand Canyon National Park is 1.2 million acres. So 1.6 million acres is about 2 times the size of Rhode Island, or 1 million football fields. Their current reservation, in contrast, is a mere 518 acres, or 392 football fields. Central Park in New York is bigger at 843 acres, and Lake Lansing here in Lansing is about 500 acres. All of those are bigger than the reservation that the Havasupai are currently living on. The really real are going to be those who inherit the earth. This is a reversal of tremendous proportions. I mean, Jesus might as well be saying right now, congrats to the Havasupai, for you shall re-inherit the Grand Canyon. So the third congratulation is congrats to the gentle, for they shall have the earth as their inheritance. And now we're on to the fourth congratulation. Here's what Jesus says. Congrats to those who hunger and thirst for justice. They shall have their fill. Our world tells us that the way to have our fill is to accumulate more and more. But Jesus tells us that the way to have our fill is to do justice. You see, the problem with the culture's answer to how to have your fill is that you always need just a little bit more, just a little bit bigger. Recently, I was up in northern Michigan at my in-laws in Boyne City, and in Boyne City, there's some big boats. But if you go to Charlevoix, there's even bigger boats. But if you go to Harbor Springs, there's really big boats. But if you go to Bay Harbor, now we're talking about the big boats. And we haven't even hit on the mega yachts yet. I mean, we're talking about big yacht on a yacht. I mean, now we've entered into the Big Ten, right? Number 10 of the Big Ten Commandments.
Hear me. Oh, hear me. All pay heed. The Lord Jehovah has given unto you these 10 commandments.
Number 10 is thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Now it's referencing thy neighbor's wife because back in the day and age, the wife was owned by the husband. Of course, we don't go along with that today, but the principle is still there. Don't covet. Don't covet your neighbor's stuff. And yet in our culture, envy and covetousness and greed, like those are the very foundations of how our economy works. Now you may wonder, why am I telling you about all this stuff about big boats? And the reason is because I notice them. I love sailing. My wife and I are members of the Lake Lansing Sailing Club. And while there aren't any big yachts there, if you'd ask me, do I want a bigger sailboat? I'd say, yeah, I could use a little bigger sailboat. Richard Rohr offers an antidote to this kind of culture of envy and covetousness and greed. He says, make sure you're not satisfied is the message. Keep yourself in a state of deliberate dissatisfaction. Jesus kicks my ass again. Rohr has a friend who suggests fasting from advertisements. I mean, fasting is like abstaining from something, usually food, but in this case, abstaining from advertisements. I mean, how would you even do that in our culture? When I look over my shoulder here, there's like ads everywhere. We're behind Frandor. It's just constantly pulling me in, pulling you in. I mean, you could cancel all your catalog subscriptions. You could get one of those things that blocks ads on your web surfing. You could cancel following your Instagram influencers who are always trying to get you to buy something new. You could mute the TV when the commercials come on. But to get away from our culture is nearly impossible. This is why something like libraries or museums in our society are so countercultural. Nobody owns anything. We own it all together, and we all get the benefit and the good use of it. All right, maybe Jesus is kicking your ass right now like he's kicked mine, and let's stop, give you a chance to kind of stop being sore in the rear end and answer this question. Here it is. When have you wanted something a little bit bigger or a little bit more? And what would it mean to live in the dissatisfaction of not getting it? Let's talk about that. All right, we're halfway through the 8 congratulations, and here's the 5th one. Congrats to the merciful. They shall have mercy shown them. Rohr reflects on this 5th congratulation, saying that he believes with all of his heart that mercy and forgiveness are the core of the gospel. Mercy is a way to describe the mystery of forgiveness. Rohr says, we do not attain anything by our own holiness, but by 10,000 surrenders to mercy. A lifetime of receiving forgiveness allows us to become mercy. That's the beatitude. We come to a point where we accept that we are accepted, and we accept others. That's the 5th congratulations. Here's the 6th. Congrats to the pure in heart. They shall see God. Richard Rohr says, when the heart is right, seeing will be right. Or I think about Madeleine L'Engle, the author of A Wrinkle in Time, who says that believing takes practice. Our culture says you have to understand first in order to believe. But L'Engle is riffing on St. Augustine, who says that no, first you have to believe and then you will understand. Or as Fox Mulder says, I want to believe. On to the 7th congratulation. Here it is. Congrats to the peacemakers. They shall be recognized as children of God. All right, I'm scared to say this next thing, so don't shoot the messenger. This is Richard Rohr. One thing we cannot call Jesus is a patriot. This is the difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking. Peacekeeping is best illustrated by, well, weapons that have that as their name. For example, the Colt Peacekeeper, or the euphemistically named Peacekeeper missile, an intercontinental ballistic missile that was part of the United States strategic nuclear arsenal from 1986 to 2005. Or you can think of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which was kept by force and violence, versus the Pax Christi, the peace of Christ, which is kept through love and invitation. In the Pax Romana, there is peace at the center of the empire, but it's only peace at the center of the empire by maintaining violent borders on the edges of empire. I mean, think about the modern day story of the Hunger Games. At the capital of Panem, there's peace. Everybody seems happy, but it's on the backs of the districts, especially District 12, on the edges of Panem. I don't think it's far-fetched at this point to say that there's a great irony in calling oneself pro-life, but not being concerned with the amazing tragedy that war takes a toll on both civilians and the military. All right, that was the 7th congratulation. Let's move on to the 8th. Congrats to those who are persecuted in the cause of justice. The reign of heaven is theirs. Persecution for the sake of justice isn't something that just happened in Jesus' day and age. It's happening right now. It's right here, right in the midst of us. And yet, there can be great joy in the midst of the persecution. Jesus says, rejoice and be glad. He says, congrats to you, for you who are persecuted for all sorts of reasons for my sake, on account of me. You have been persecuted like they persecuted the prophets of old. Richard Rohr reflects on this congratulation, saying, something is true gospel if it engenders criticism and the spreading of falsehoods. Too much praise is probably an indication that it is not the full gospel. Did I mention I struggle with this? I mean, here Jesus is kicking my ass again. There's definitely some truth in this. There's definitely truth in it. I mean, Jesus said it. And yet I have seen this sort of persecuted posture by so many people for so many things without any ability to reflect on whether they might be right or wrong in the first place. And this doesn't just happen on the right side of the aisle, it happens on the left side as well. There is certainly something true here. You can't work against unjust powers and structures without experiencing some persecution. I mean, you can't do anything significant in our culture really any time in any place without somebody giving you a hard time about it. But especially now in our social media saturated world. And yet Jesus' words remind those of us who have power to use that power to raise up those who are on the underside of power. Here's a chat question to finish out these last 4 congratulations. When was a time you were criticized for doing what you thought was the right thing? And when was a time that the criticism ended up being true? Let's talk about it. Jesus concludes his congratulatory lines speaking to his closest followers, saying, "You are salt of the earth, light for the world, a city on a hill." When we live according to Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, we give a gift back to all of creation. People, plants, animals, the earth, the whole universe. When Jesus' followers live according to Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, they give taste to the world. They preserve the world. Once again, Madeline Langle says, we draw people to Christ not by loudly discrediting what they believe, by telling them how wrong they are and how right we are, but by showing them a light that is so lovely that they want with all their hearts to know the source of it. As we've gone up the mountain today to encounter Jesus' words, his opening lines in the Sermon on the Mount, I pray that for those of you who needed hope and comfort and encouragement, that you encountered God in Jesus' words. And for those of you who needed a good ass kicking today, I pray that you got it too. In the name of Jesus, amen.